palace takes on a very different feeling at night time. During the day, it's still very much that party palace that it was built to be. Has a very happy atmosphere. It's usually filled with school children running around and families enjoying a day out, and people just standing and looking around them in awe. But at night, when the sun has set and we've closed those big old wooden doors, the palace takes on a very different atmosphere, and it's very sort of tangible. And it really is like you could just reach out and touch the past. It's fascinating.
Welcome to the British History channel with me, Philippa Lacey Brewell, and to our latest historian interview. If you've been here before, thank you for coming back and supporting this channel. I hope you enjoy everything you are seeing. If you are new here, then a big warm welcome. If you love British history, then you are definitely in the right place. So please take a look back through the channel. There are plenty of historian interviews, mini documentaries and virtual tours for you to watch. It's also the place where you can join me live each Wednesday at 1 o'clock for a tea time history chat live. Now, today I am talking to Sarah Slater. She is also known as Hampton Court Tour Guide. Let's get this right. Hampton Court Tour Guide on Instagram. And I'm going to talk to her about what it's like to guide at one of the world's most iconic historical sites. Now, Sarah joined Historic Royal Palaces, who run Hampton Court Palace, in 2008 as a state apartment warder and guide. She studied through the Open University and trained as a guide lecturer. She holds her white badge as an affiliate of the Institute of Tourist Guiding. She leads tours at Hampton Court Palace and indeed guides my groups when we visit Hampton Court Palace for the Anne Boleyn tour each May. Sarah has a passion for the palace, its history, the art and architecture there, but also has a particular interest in the human stories and about those who have lived there, the social history. Now, as usual, members of my British History Patreon club have submitted their own questions for Sarah, which I will put to her after the main interview. Now, that section makes up the extended ad-free version of the episode, which members of my Patreon can access. Now, if you're not already a patron, check out the details of all the great history lover benefits, including putting your own questions to future guests and, of course, taking part in our brand new book club, historical book club, introduced in 2023, and that all comes with your membership as well. It's just £5 a month. You can find all the details for that at www.patreon.com/British History. Now, Sarah, welcome to the British History channel. Thank you for joining me today.
I'm looking forward to it.
So I've given everyone a brief introduction to you, but can you introduce yourself in your own words, please?
Yeah, sure. So my name's Sarah Slater. I am one of the guide lecturers at Hampton Court Palace. Essentially, I'm an affiliate of the Institute of Tourist Guiding. I'm sure many of you may have heard of the Blue Badge tourist guides, which you might well see sort of around London and other areas. The Institute of Tourist Guiding has 3 different badges that people can become qualified for. A blue badge generally does a whole area. So, for instance, London, the southeast, south central, heart of England. You get green badges, which are generally sort of cities. So, for instance, Southampton. And you get white badges, which are one sort of specific location. So I have a white badge, which I am very proud of.
I was wondering what the difference was. Thank you for that.
Yeah. So a white badge, this one, as you can see, well, hopefully you can see, the focus isn't really picking up, but it's got the logo there for Hampton Court Palace. And that means essentially I am an expert on Hampton Court Palace. It's actually a really good qualification to have. I'm really proud of it. The exams are very arduous, so it's good if you can get a guide who is qualified. You know you're getting the best. So I've worked at Hampton Court Palace for 15 years now, which has gone by in an absolute flash. I do say work loosely because they do say that if you enjoy your job, you never work a day in your life, and I can tell you that is honestly true. I have loved every single moment of being at Hampton Court Palace. Back in 2008, I started as a state apartment warder, which are now called palace hosts. They're the people who wear the red coats. So I would be welcoming guests on the gate, standing in the rooms to answer questions. And after I'd only been there a couple of years, an opportunity came up to guide, and they asked me if I would like to train to be one of the guides. So I went through the training process, and I've been guiding ever since. And now, of course, I'm no longer a palace host. I am just a guide now, but I absolutely love it. I live about 10 miles out from from Hampton Court Palace in Surrey. So it's not too arduous journey either. It's very nice and easy to get to. But I do absolutely love the palace and all aspects of it.
That's wonderful. I mean, I know you from there, James Peacock, obviously Tracy Borman. When you all post, like that's your office. That's where you work. That's incredible.
I know.
But heritage is your second career. So what? And clearly it was the correct choice. But what made you decide to move into heritage, and was it Hampton Court Palace you had an eye on specifically when you were making that move?
Absolutely. So I've actually had quite a varied career. I actually started off in acting many, many, many years ago. I was a child actor and stunt woman, believe it or not. Oh. So I was in a couple of films, lots of TV adverts, modelling work, etc. So acting kind of feels like it's always been in my blood. I had an agent since the age of 3. But then when I got to secondary school, my parents sort of said, you need to get a proper job. So I went into banking, which was fun when I started. I did really love banking. I love the camaraderie involved in the office. And I've done various different jobs within banking as well, from business advisor to mortgage advisor. And it always used to be really lovely when you could actually get to signing date and people could sign for their mortgages and you knew that perhaps they were buying their first house. But I had my 2 children and I was working part-time at the bank. And it was always a bit of a, trying to sort of juggle home life, children, working in a career. And just by chance, really, I happened to see the job at Hampton Court Palace. And I'd always had a love of history. History was my passion. I was a member of the National Trust, English Heritage. And I saw this job come up and I thought, oh my gosh, that sounds really interesting. So I actually phoned them, to ask a few more details. And they were advertising for full-time staff. But I asked if they would consider a part-time post. And they, luckily for me, they were more than open to it. So I went along for my interview and I got the job. I couldn't believe it. So I suddenly was working in something that to me had always just been a passion, a hobby, if you like. Sort of going, weekends would be spent going and visiting historic houses. I'd always lived near Hampton Court Palace. There's, many, many photos of me being pushed around the gardens in my pram or toddling around the gardens. So it always had a special place in my heart. So to be able to now work here is amazing. Wow.
I want to ask you about your stunt work, but we'll do that another time.
Another day.
So before we get into sort of looking at what's the interesting, intriguing parts of being a guide at the palace, can we talk a bit about its history, since as we are talking to an expert here, and we have this incredible, it's sort of a complex of buildings, so that's how I think of it, which splits literally down the middle into these 2 different palaces from 2 distinct periods of history, and each of them seem to be just frozen in time. I know that's wonderful work as well that the palace does to interpret it that way. So can you explain to people how we get to the building that we have today?
Yes, it's a very complex history. So to be able to sort of put it down into a couple of minutes is going to be really hard. Most people think that Cardinal Wolsey turned up in 1515 and dug some foundations and built a palace. Many other people believe that Henry VIII built the palace, but actually there's a much longer history to the site. there was actually a manor house here before Wolsey began to build his palace. And that manor house was very huge. It was very elaborate. It was actually leased by a gentleman called Giles Daubeny, who was actually the Chancellor to King Henry VII. And we know it must have been very big and grand because the King, Henry VII, and the Queen, Elizabeth of York, would often visit. The building and the land was actually owned by the Knights Hospitallers, and that goes right the way back to the 13th century. So essentially, when Wolsey arrives in 1515, he takes on a 99-year lease for the palace, and he transforms, the manor house, and he transforms it into the palace. He puts a whole new wing on the west, which is Base Court, which is the sort of main gatehouse where you enter today as a visitor. He built this beautiful palace for entertaining ambassadors, hosting events, and of course there were some grand royal apartments for the King, Henry VIII, and also his Queen, Catherine of Aragon, when they visited. Now, of course, I'm sure all of your listeners will be aware that Wolsey falls rather dramatically from favour, and it's debated whether or not he gave the palace to Henry VIII or whether or not Henry VIII took it. But of course, it then becomes a royal palace, and Henry VIII begins to extend it as well with Anne Boleyn. They put on a whole new wing on the eastern side, so they're expanding it out the other way. They also put a couple of extra wings on the front as well. And they build a whole new suite of royal apartments, which is actually then used by every subsequent monarch, including not a monarch at all, but the Lord Protector, Oliver Cromwell. He uses Hampton Court Palace as essentially his weekend residence. And that's actually why the palace survived, because if Cromwell hadn't decided to use it, it may well have been sold off and broken up. We then, of course, have the restoration of the monarchy in 1660. And it's when William and Mary come to the throne in 1689 that there is major changes. They actually, with their architect, Sir Christopher Wren, they demolish all of the Tudor Queen's apartments that had been built for Anne Boleyn. And they also actually demolish 2/3 of Henry VIII's sort of privy lodgings, private apartments, and they rebuild in this Baroque style, which gives us the palace of two halves. Many people think that William and Mary and Wren destroyed all of Henry's apartments, but actually 2/3 survive. Some of them are not recognisable because they were altered later by George II. And then, of course, it ceases to be a royal palace under George III. When he becomes king in 1760, he decides it's no longer suitable. So it's at that point that the palace became what is known as a grace and favour residence. To sort of simplify it, if you had done something great and good for the country, or perhaps if you had died, and your widow would be given rent-free accommodation at the palace. So this palace turns into this huge suite of apartments. It was like its own little sort of village, its own little apartment complex. And essentially, again, that is what helps it to survive, because, of course, if it hadn't been turned into grace and favour, again, it may well have been demolished, fallen out of favour, etc. So it's quite nice that its history evolved over time, and that's essentially why it has survived.
So it's always had a purpose.
Yes.
It's changed, but it's always had a purpose.
And what I like about it is, its purpose was as an entertaining space. Wolsey would entertain here, Henry VIII entertained here, and it still is today. We're entertaining the visitors who come, or people can also hire the venue for functions and events, so people can get married here. So it's still following the exact same purpose that it had originally.
That's really fascinating. I hadn't actually realised that Wolsey hadn't started. I knew there was a manor house before, but I'd assumed he'd flattened it and started again. But he actually added to that then.
Yes. So we believe that the part of the Tudor kitchens were actually Giles Daubony's kitchens, and they were just extended by Wolsey. And there's a few other sections as well, which we think might be from the time of the Knights Hospitallers, the time of Giles Daubony. But most of them are just sort of internal walls that have been sort of added to. But yeah, the Tudor kitchens, part of it, they believe, was Giles Daubony's.
Ah, that's really interesting. I've learned something already. So if we could go back in time and visit the palace, then have all of that history, this is going to be really difficult, isn't it? What year would you like to go back to, and why?
Okay, so there is actually one year that I would really like to go back to, because there's a specific person that I would want to meet. Now, I would like to go back to 1562, and it would have to be the summer, so maybe September, maybe October. And I would like to meet Dame Sybil Penn. Now, Dame Sybil Penn was an extraordinary gentlewoman of the Privy Chamber to Queen Elizabeth I, but she had actually been there for many years. She was initially employed at the palace in 1538 to be the dry nurse to King Edward. I should say Prince Edward, who goes on to become King Edward VI. So she's employed by Henry VIII to be the dry nurse for Edward. So she sees Edward growing up. She sees the marriage arrangements for Anne of Cleves. She sees the divorce annulment for Anne of Cleves. She sees the marriage to Catherine Howard. She sees the arrest of Catherine Howard. She sees Catherine Parr, bringing the daughters back into the family, as it were. She then, of course, is there when Edward becomes king. She also sees the establishment of the Church of England. She then sees Mary become our very first ever crowned Queen of England, because she's recorded as riding in Mary's funeral procession. She then rides in Elizabeth I's coronation procession. And of course, she is one of the women who nurses Elizabeth through smallpox when she has smallpox at Hampton Court Palace. Unfortunately, she catches the smallpox from the Queen and she dies at Hampton Court Palace on the 6th of November, 1562. So she would be a really, really interesting person to sit down with and have a bit of a natter, shall we say. I'd love to meet her. So yeah, that's my year.
That's a very good reason as well. Yeah, so she's just been on the periphery of all of those events. Oh goodness, yes, to be able to access her knowledge of them and her opinions of them would have been amazing.
So she would have first-hand accounts of most of that. It would be very interesting.
Yeah. And not a name you hear a lot about, maybe because she did not survive the smallpox.
No. So she was, again, she was a dry nurse, and then she was a gentlewoman of the Privy Chamber. But so she's not one of the big names. She isn't someone that we've really got any sort of portraits of that survive or anything like that. But I think she'd be a very interesting lady to chat to.
Definitely. So I want to talk myths. I mean, the palace is known for ghosts and myths, but are there any myths about the palace? You know, things that we've been told which aren't accurate or true, but that I don't know, it seem to, with the retelling, become accepted. I'm thinking the Victorians must have done something at some point to make up something that we still believe. But so come on, what's some of the myths? You must get them.
So there's a lot. Yeah. There are a lot. But the one I picked is the tunnels. Now, when I first started at Hampton Court Palace, people always talk about the tunnels under the palace. There are rumours that there were tunnels to get to the Mitre pub, which is across the road, tunnels all the way to Oatlands Palace and to Nonsuch Palace, and how people could come and go secretly. The thing is, of course, there's been a lot of excavations under the palace at various points. No tunnels have ever been found, but they haven't been ruled out. There's still this rumour that the tunnels exist. Now, the year after I started, back in 2009, they did a huge archaeological dig in Base Court, because when I started, Base Court was actually laid to turf, and then they decided for the anniversary of Henry VIII's accession, so in 2009, 500 years, they decided to recobble Base Court. I'm sure if you visit today, you'll see that it's all the grass, the turf is all gone. It's all cobbles now. But of course, they took the opportunity to do an archaeological dig. They found all of the original conduits, the pipe works, etc., the drainage. It was really interesting to see it all laid bare. And there is one of what looks like a tunnel. It is one of the sort of drainage conduits, but it's open. It's got glass over the top, so you can look down and see into it. And that is in one of the sets of Base Court toilets. It used to be a ladies' toilet, but now it is both genders. So it always used to be a shame that I could take ladies in there and show them the tunnel, but I couldn't take the men. But of course, now I can take everyone in. It always seems a bit strange when I say to people, follow me into this toilet.
Yeah. So we can.
But yeah, I'd love to know if the tunnels really are there.
Didn't they appear in Peaky Blinders? They seem to insinuate.
I think they did actually.
They did.
Yeah, because I forgot about that. Yeah, they did. You're right.
Any others? Are there any really common ones that the visitors might? Where about you?
I'm not really sure. That off the top of my head, I'm just trying to think. I mean, obviously, most people always think that the palace was built by Henry VIII, which of course isn't true. There's always myths about the ghosts and where the ghosts are and what they're doing. I think there is quite a lot. I mean, there's a lot of things you always get people saying, oh, the Tudors were all really short, weren't they? No, they're not. Henry VIII, we know, was sort of 6'1.5". And we know exactly what size he was and height at any point in his life, because of course we've still got all of his armour, which is like an outer shell. So we know exactly how big he was. Lots of other rumours. You hear people sort of will say, oh, well, of course, in the Great Hall. I have heard people saying, in the Great Hall, there was just straw on the floor and people sort of would urinate against the tapestries and that sort of thing. Absolutely not. There's no way you would have done that in the King's house.
Interesting. Yeah. I hadn't realised to what an extent Henry had built, actually. So I was thinking most of it was there with Wolsey and he sort of updated it. Whereas from what you're saying, it sounds like they actually built on quite a lot.
They did.
So
yes.
That's
all out the eastern side. So a whole new wing was put on for Anne Boleyn. And that went along the north side of what was called Cloister Green Court. This was the new courtyard, and it went into the east. And Henry VIII, there had already been a long gallery along the south, which was Wolsey's, but Henry altered it, he extended it, and he brought it along the north side to meet up with Anne Boleyn's apartments. Of course, the sad thing was, no sooner was the paint dry on those apartments than Anne Boleyn, of course, fell and was beheaded. Jane Seymour became the queen, but she sort of took one look at Anne's designs and said, no, I want something of my own style. So Anne Boleyn's apartments were re-altered and redecorated, which of course is why it's thought that Jane Seymour was not in those apartments when she gave birth, because they were still being finished to her specifications. So she actually, believes she gave birth to Edward in what had been the room set aside by Wolsey for Catherine of Aragon off of Clock Court. So really the first ones to actually use the Queen's apartments was, of course, Anne of Cleve, Catherine Howard and Catherine Parr. Interestingly, when Oliver Cromwell became the Lord Protector, he chose to use the Queen's apartments rather than the King's. And we can only assume that that's because perhaps they were a bit more fashionable, because they would have been at that point refitted out for Henrietta Maria.
Did it have a better view? Did they have...
No, because obviously the King, personally I don't think so. Obviously the south side has the view over the Privy Gardens, which was set aside for the King, and the river, whereas the east side had views over Home Park, which was obviously part of the hunting ground. So maybe Oliver Cromwell preferred it. We don't know. It would be interesting to find out.
So I'm just thinking back to the myth about the height. Am I right in thinking that comes from the beds People looking at the length of beds and assuming that meant that everyone was short, but they actually used to sleep, or it's more likely that they slept kind of almost not sat up, but at
sort
an
of propped up.
Mm.
And also the doorways as well. You know, a lot of the doorways are fairly small. And again, people sort of say, oh, that's because they were all really short. But actually, it was probably more of an economical thing, because, of course, if you're paying to heat a room and you open a big wide door and let all the heat out when people are coming in and out, you're not going to keep it hot for very long. So it's believed that that's more economical. And it's one thing that's quite interesting at Hampton Court Palace is when you go from the horn room into the Great Watching Chamber, or from the short gallery into the Great Watching Chamber, you can still see the original outline of the Tudor door going up the side, because they've removed the plaster to expose it. But actually, the door you're going through is a huge Stuart door that was put in by William and Mary, because I think by the time they came to the throne, small doorways were, of course, very unfashionable, and you wanted to have a nice big doorway to show off the height and the architecture, etc.
And the dresses have got bigger and
I mean a little
bit
so, not really so much William and Mary, but by the time you get to the Georgians, my goodness.
You need a big doorway.
Yes, I do wear because obviously I didn't say when I introduced myself, but I of course do costume tours or tours in business attire, and yes, when I'm wearing my Georgian gown, I definitely need all the doors opening as wide as possible.
Oh yes, well, Sarah does her tours for us in her Tudor gown. Look fabulous. So I'd love to. I need to come and do a Georgian one, so I can see you in your Georgian dress as well.
Yeah.
So I mean, so with William and Mary, I meant to ask this earlier. Again, am I right in thinking by that point they sort of had ideas of moving, or they would prefer the court to have been further out of London? I think William was asthmatic, which of course at a time before proper treatments must have been very, very scary. And they wanted somewhere, with better air, I suppose. And that's why they didn't just take to Hampton Court Palace for no particular reason. They were looking at basing themselves there. Am I right in saying that?
Absolutely. Yeah. So obviously London at that time was very dirty, and obviously smoke, etc. Like, you're correct, William had asthma, and the clean air outside of London at Hampton Court Palace would have suited him much better. Not only that, but he was big into his hunting, and of course Hampton Court Palace had wonderful hunting grounds, and that's why actually when you walk around the palace, you'll notice that all the staircases are really fairly shallow, and it's said that was designed with William's asthma in mind. He also had a ground floor, well, it's believed he had a ground floor bedroom as well as his first floor bedrooms, and that's so that if he was suffering with asthma, he could just stay on in his private apartments on the ground floor. The other thing you'll see a lot of as you walk around Hampton Court Palace are lots of barometers. So in the Queen's apartments and also in William's apartments, you'll see many barometers on the wall, and that's because the weather changes did really affect his asthma. So he kind of needed to know what to expect, shall we say. But yes, they really did take to Hampton Court Palace. They loved the location. They just hated this dirty, dusty old Tudor palace that was on the site, because of course it was very old-fashioned by that point. Their intention was to build a new palace with Sir Christopher Wren that would rival Versailles, over near Paris in France. And of course, luckily for us, William ran out of money, essentially. So they demolished all of the Tudor Queen's apartments, like I say, 2/3 of Henry VIII's apartments, and rebuilt that whole eastern courtyard in the Baroque style. The only thing that they were going to keep of the Tudor Palace was the Great Hall. They were going to realign their entrance. They were going to enter from Bushy Park. They built this beautiful big long Chestnut Avenue, which still survived. You would have come along that Chestnut Avenue from the north. You would have come into the Great Hall, which was essentially would have been an entrance hall. And then you would have gone into this beautiful Baroque palace. Like I say, though, luckily they ran out of money. So only that eastern section got completed. And they had to finish that on a bit of a shoestring budget, it has to be said. So, of course, they had to retain the Tudor Palace. So we were very lucky.
We are lucky. I think we are lucky to have the Baroque palace as well.
Mm.
As tragic as it is that we lost Anne Boleyn's apartments, for instance, but and I think, did we lose Henry VIII's bathroom? I'm intrigued by the rumours of this Turkish bathroom that he had.
Yeah, so we didn't lose the bathroom, but we did lose the bathroom.
Right.
So when Henry was extending, one of the first extensions he put on was to the rooms that Wolsey had set aside for his use. So he built something called the Bain Tower, which was essentially a sort of double height extension on the back. And that he moved his private bedchamber into there. And he had an ensuite bathroom. He did have a beautifully decorated bathroom. There's sort of records of how the paintings that he had put in there and the gilding work, etc. He also had a little treasury, library, etc. But of course, he then extended further along the south, like I say, into the east. And he had another bedchamber, privy lodgings put in. So the Bain Tower became more sort of part of the state apartments. It was sort of the next section on from where people would come to see him for audiences. Whereas the privy lodgings, that big extension, unfortunately, we don't even really know all of the rooms that were in that section, because most of the records we've got are from when people, from when work was done. Obviously, we've got a lot of the invoices still, etc. But people would write home and they'd say, I went and saw the king and I saw this decoration and he's got this in that room and that in that room. Whereas because nobody ever went into the privy chambers, we don't have that sort of detail, unfortunately.
I'm just trying to think if there's any example of a Tudor bathroom. I know we've got privies still, Hampton Court, for instance, but I'm trying to think if we've got. I've never come across an example of a high class or royal bathroom.
I'm not sure. I mean, I would need to have a look into that and see if one survived. Obviously, at Hampton Court Palace, we still got Caroline's bathroom, but that's much later. That's Georgian. That's 18th century. But you do get to see Caroline's bathroom if it's open.
So we've talked about quite a few of them already, but there's so many people who've lived in the palace. Of course, it's got a long history, but also all these different purposes that we've talked about. Is there anyone other than Sybil, who we've already mentioned, anyone who's lived there whose story you wish, or you'd like to see told? Maybe someone we haven't heard of or we've heard of, but we don't hear their story in much detail.
So there was a family called the Gordons. They lived there in the Grace and Favour period, and believe it or not, one of them, she lived there for over 100 years. But they were she when they moved in, she was a tiny baby, and she lived to just over the age of 100. So she lived there her entire life. But they were a really interesting family. They were always getting themselves into scrapes. The father, the husband, he actually mysteriously disappeared one day, never to be heard of again. Unfortunately, they were really struck with tragedy as well. One of the daughters died at the palace. She went to warm herself in front of the fire one morning when she got up, and her nightdress caught light, and unfortunately she perished. Their son got a telling off for defacing the no smoking signs. They nearly caused a fire in the gardens. They allowed their bathroom to flood one day, and the water poured down into the state apartments. They were a very, very interesting family, and I would love to hear more about the Gordons, because they were just a Grace and Favour family, but very, very interesting. So yeah, it's definitely the Gordons and Sybil Penn for me. I'd love to know more about Sybil Penn and hear her story told.
Yeah. So I mean, you're there so often. What's your favourite thing to point out to people who come to the palace?
Okay, again, so many,
Yeah.
so hard to choose. But I'm actually going to say the stained glass windows in the Great Hall. When we first start training as guides, we have to come up with a little 15-minute talk about an object or a person, a personality. So my object was the stained glass windows in the Great Hall. I always used to get quite upset when I was first training that people would dismiss the stained glass because they say, oh, it's Victorian, you know. But it was done by Thomas Willimant, who was one of the preeminent stained glass artists of his day. It was made between 1840 and 1846. So it was commissioned when, of course, Queen Victoria was opening, I should say, the palace to the public. But Willimant really thought about what he was putting into that stained glass, and he tells Henry's story. So in the east window, which is where the sun rises, we have how Henry came to the throne. We have Henry right in the centre, but below him we have the two branches of his family. We have the Lancasters surrounded by red roses. We have the Yorks surrounded by the white. And these two branches, of course, come from Edward III down at the bottom. And it tells us his, his ancestry and how he came to the throne. As the sun moves around the south side of the palace, we go through various other people's stories. So we have the bay window, which shows us Cardinal Wolsey. As it moves around the south, we go through the first three queens. So each queen has a window that's dedicated to them. The first three, so Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour, are on the south side. On the north side, where the sun never goes, and Henry's personality was a bit darker, we have, of course, have Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, and Catherine Parr. All six wives were descended from King Edward I. So each window actually takes you from their ancestry from Edward I. So you start in the bottom left-hand corner of each window, you go up through their ancestors' coats of arms, you go across the top, you go back down the bottom right until you get to their coat of arms with Henry. And then, and also the windows are filled with their badges. So for instance, in Catherine of Aragon's, you've got the pomegranate, you've got the sheath of arrows for Castile and Aragon. You've got, in Anne Boleyn's, of course, you've got the falcon as well. When you get round to the west window, which is where the sun sets, you have Henry's legacy. So you have Henry in the centre. You have the six wives' coats of arms on either side of him, which of course instantly tells you it's not Tudor, because there's no way he would have had all six wives next to him at once. But underneath him, you have the three children. You have the legacy. So of course, as the sun sets in the very bottom right-hand corner, it goes through Elizabeth's coat of arms, and then it's dark, and that's the end of the Tudors. So I love the stained glass windows. They're beautiful.
I had no idea there was such a story. I'm right. You've taught me something again, because I admit to being a little bit dismissive of Victorian stained glass, and the fact that was so, that there's a purpose to every pane that was designed there, and where they were placed. And of course, the continual story around the whole of the Great Hall. That's incredible.
Yeah, I love it. Next time you come, remind me. I'll try and point it all out to you. But it is, like I say, I used to have to talk on it for 15 minutes. There's so much more than 15 minutes worth. But it's fascinating. Absolutely fascinating.
Yeah. So what do you find surprises people the most about the palace when you're telling them?
Gosh, usually that there are two halves. Most people just assume that there is Henry VIII's palace. So they assume that Henry VIII built it, and he's pretty much the only one that ever lived there. So when you explain that there are actually two halves to this palace, essentially when you step through that doorway at the end of the long gallery, you essentially step forward by 150 years. You suddenly are in this completely different architecture and time zone. So that really surprises people. And just that there is so much history. Like I say, the fact that every monarch, including, of course, our Lord Protector, lived there. until George III. The fact that it then became grace and favour and had so many other people living there who again were equally, many of them are equally famous in their own right. And then of course the fact that today it is still an entertainment space, but it is also of course lots of offices. I don't know if you've noticed, but as you walk around some of the courtyards, you'll see that the windows have films on them, showing pictures, perhaps, a gentleman in a room chatting or something. And of course, that's because it is hiding a modern office behind that window, and it would sort of dispel the beauty of it if you walk past a window and saw someone sat on their computer. But of course, it is the head office for essentially for Historic Royal Palaces, which is the wonderful charity that looks after the Tower of London, Hampton Court Palace, Kensington Palace, Kew Palace, Hillsborough, and of course the banqueting house as well.
Yes, over the group of properties that are looked after by Historic Royal Palaces, and just some of the most iconic in the country, aren't they, and in the world probably.
Absolutely,
they do an incredible job. So what's your actually no, you've just reminded me again of something else.
Oh no,
because we've already spoke about Jane Seymour gave birth not in the apartments that were being altered for her, which have been destroyed since, but probably back in part of the palace that survives. And it's just reminded me, because you're talking about, of course, this is a working palace, it's a working place, there are offices, there are training rooms, of which the room that Jane Seymour is believed to have given birth in
absolutely. Yeah, so obviously the Bain Tower and the rooms that were set aside by Wolsey for the King and Queen, they still survive. Now Henry's rooms are actually, most of them are actually what we call the Cumberland Gallery, which is a little art gallery. You would never know that you were in Henry's rooms when you were in there, because they've been completely redecorated by the Georgians, by George II. So you'll be wandering through what was Henry's audience chamber, his privy chamber, or perhaps his presence chamber, and you wouldn't have a clue that is where you were. The rooms above were, of course, the Queen's apartments, and essentially, one room has been changed into the changing room for the costumed interpreters, and the other room, which was the bedroom, is a training room. So again, it's all Georgianized. You wouldn't know that you were in a Tudor room, except for the fact it still has the Tudor fireplace. So when you go in, you walk into what you think is this sort of blue painted room, but then the second you step through the door, you look to the right and you see this huge stone fireplace. And of course, as we've already mentioned, these are the rooms where Jane Seymour gave birth. It's probably also the rooms that, of course, Anne Boleyn would have used while the new chambers were being built. And of course, it is the rooms that were used by Catherine of Aragon as well. Interestingly, Wolsey's motto and beast, which was the griffin, survive. So they are still on the fireplace, but the little stone escutcheons above it, they've been hacked off. So whether or not they were Catherine of Aragon's or Anne Boleyn's, we're not sure, but they've gone. But Wolsey's motto is still there.
Interesting, intriguing. And you're very good, because if you're ever guiding one of my groups and you can get us in there, you do, but it's not on the visitor route, so I feel very special when you manage to get us in there. Do you have a favourite part of the palace?
I do. Well, I mean, I've got lots of favourite parts. So as well as guiding around the palace and the gardens, I also am one of the few members of staff who's trained to take visitors up on the roof as well. So I do take roof tours up, and I absolutely love it up there. It's 106 steps to the top, and then you have to sort of climb through this little door, and then you are up on the roof, and my goodness, it is just amazing. I mean, obviously you get very up close and personal with those magnificent Tudor chimneys that Hampton Court Palace is famous for. Fantastic views, obviously, across the grounds and the gardens. You can see for miles. And of course, you get to see the palace from a completely different angle. You're looking down onto the roof. One thing that I found quite interesting when I first went up there, when you look down on the roof for the great kitchen, the roof tiles are patterned, so they're actually laid out in a zigzag pattern, which of course, and these are black and red tiles, so you never know that was, you know, from the ground. You never know it was there, but of course you get up and yes, you can book private roof tours. I have to quickly add in, I'm not sort of tempting you with something you never get to see, but you have to book a private tour to go up on the roof. So I love the roof. I love the Great Hall. The Great Hall is just magnificent. I mean, when you are trained to be a guide, you're only meant to spend 5 minutes at each stop. But the Great Hall, I tend to break it down into 3 stops, so I can do about 15 minutes in there because you need it. The Great Hall is, you know, absolutely magnificent. And then, of course, I also love going up onto the 3rd floor and the 4th floor up into the attics, sort of, you know, going around all the rooms that are mainly used for storage now. But I absolutely love it up there.
Fantastic. It must be amazing to have access to all those different places as well.
It is. I feel very privileged. But of course, it does mean that when you go and visit other places, I always want to know what's behind the door. I'm used to being able to walk.
I know there's something there.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I bet. So, and do you get a different reaction from people? You were talking earlier about when you're in costume and when you can either do it in business dress or costume. Do you get a different reaction from people when you're in costume? And is there a difference between the 2 costumes if you do?
Yes and yes.
Ah.
So you do get a different reaction. People suddenly do treat you very differently. And it does depend on what you're wearing. So for instance, if I'm in my Georgian gown, I do notice that suddenly people will open doors for me and
really?
you know, sort of be very deferential. It's amazing, the sort of responses that you get from people. You do also get people feeling that they can just suddenly touch you, though, which is quite interesting. You know, like when you're pregnant and people sort of think it's okay to touch your belly. It is exactly the same when you're in costume. People just want to. Even yesterday, I had someone rubbing my stomacher to see how hot it was. I know it's yeah.
I've heard this from other costume interpreters, actually.
Yeah. I would say that if you visit, please always ask before you touch. But yeah, it's interesting. People do suddenly sort of, a lot of people do suddenly treat you as though you really are a lady of the court, particularly when, I'm in my Tudor costume, because I say my Tudor one. At the moment, I'm very, very grateful to my colleague Siobhan, who has lent me her Tudor costume this year. But people do really sort of gasp and look and think, oh wow. And of course it's lovely because people can, rather than just looking at picture, people are actually seeing what you're wearing, and seeing all the layers and what's involved. And of course when you put a costume on, it does automatically make you stand differently and walk differently. And I love it.
I've only worn Tudor dress, I've not worn Georgian, but you definitely end up walking differently, and so you just can't do anything else, can you? No. You have to stand up straight.
Absolutely.
I'm always intrigued by the difference as well. You know, I've seen you in costume and obviously not in costume, especially when you've guided us in costume in the morning, and then you'll come and have lunch with me, and of course I know it's you when you're in costume and you when you're not, but you realize just what, when you're looking at a portrait of someone, for instance, and it's 500 years ago, I just to imagine them as a normal person, as in if you were contemporary to them, which I know there's people now who take portraits and make them look modern, so that you can kind of get an idea. And it's so powerful, actually. It brings them to being a real person, if you see what I mean.
And that's something I always really try and concentrate on when I'm guiding or giving a lecture. I want people to remember that these were real people. They weren't just names and dates, and they weren't two-dimensional. These were three-dimensional people. They were exactly the same as you and I. They had many, they did have different belief systems to what we have today. They didn't have the conveniences that we have today. But they were the same people. They still loved exactly the same way as we did. They still had the same feelings, the same thoughts. And I always try and get that across.
Wonderful. So I've got another few questions for you before we move on to the patron only section, but we're going to have to talk about ghosts, because the palace is isn't it, it's quite notorious for its ghosts. So you must get asked about it all the time, but what are your favorite ghost stories?
Okay, so
I think you have some, don't you?
There are many.
Okay.
I love the ghost stories. I do lead the ghost tours. We haven't run the ghost tours since COVID. You can book a private ghost tour at the moment, but we're not running the public ones. But I am fascinated by the ghosts. I'm fascinated by people's reactions of coming into the palace at night. The palace takes on a very different feeling at night time. During the day, it's still very much that party palace that it was built to be. Has a very happy atmosphere. It's usually filled with school children running around and families enjoying a day out, and people just standing and looking around them in awe. But at night, when the sun has set and we've closed those big old wooden doors, the palace takes on a very different atmosphere, and it's very sort of tangible. And it really is like you could just reach out and touch the past. It's fascinating. I love to tell the story of Catherine Howard. So Catherine Howard's ghost is said to haunt the Long Gallery, which is more popularly known as the Haunted Gallery. Without having to go into her whole story, essentially, the Haunted Gallery seems to have a very odd atmosphere about it. Catherine Howard's ghost is heard to scream, and she is heard to scream at night. And people who have heard her have reported that it's this unearthly scream followed by a deathly silence. Her ghost is seen. She is seen to run along the gallery and get to the door to the King's royal pew, scream, turn with her clothes all disordered, and then get taken back along the gallery as though perhaps she were being dragged. And it's said that she is reenacting one of her last moments at Hampton Court Palace, because the legend has it that when she was under house arrest in her rooms, at one point she broke free and ran along the Haunted Gallery, or Long Gallery as I should call it. She got to the door to scream for Henry. It was said that she believed that if she could perhaps speak to him one last time, she might be able to beg his forgiveness. But of course, she didn't know that Henry wasn't there. Henry had actually left the palace. The guards obviously grabbed her and took her back to her rooms. But it's said that once she was beheaded, of course, her ghost returned. We have lots of strange things happening in the Haunted Gallery as well. A lot of working dogs really do not like the Haunted Gallery. There was one particular occasion where we were expecting a visit from Her late Majesty, Elizabeth II, and the police sniffer dog was brought up to sweep through the room. And when you think these police sniffer dogs, they're highly trained, aren't they? But it didn't matter what the handler did. The dog flatly refused to enter the gallery and just lay on the floor, whimpering and crying. They actually had to radio for another dog to be brought up. And the second dog went in, no problem. But the first dog, absolutely no way. And the other thing, of course, the big thing is that we have women who will faint underneath a particular chandelier in the Haunted Gallery. And I have had, personally, I've had 2 women go, but they didn't fully faint, but they were about to go. We had to quickly sit them down. But yeah, we've had many women fainting there. But I do like to tell that story just because I like to tell Catherine as she was, because I don't know what it was like for you, but when I was growing up at school, she was always very much sort of, the one who was a bit naughty and was a bit of a child and, committed adultery. And of course, that isn't her true story. So I do like to tell that one. Obviously, we have the ghost of Sybil Penn, one of my favourite characters.
Well, I was wondering then if she has a ghost, seeing as she died there. Oh, I'm quite
okay. So Sybil Penn is our most frequently seen ghost. So we have many ghost stories. Well, at the beginning of lockdown, I actually started to write down all the ghost stories I was aware of, and believe it or not, I got to about 130. And I'm sure there's more out there. But Sybil Penn is the one who has the most recorded sightings. So she is usually seen either in the southwest wing. So this is the one between the main gatehouse and the river. She's seen inside the wing. She's seen outside the wing. She haunts in front of the palace near the moat. She haunts the cloisters around Base Court. She haunts the gardens on the south side. And again, I like to tell her story because for a long time, she had this really bad reputation. It all goes back to the time when Princess Frederica of Hanover was living at the palace. She was living in that southwest wing, and one day she walked into her baby's nursery and she saw this woman in grey leaning over the cradle. Now, of course, she screamed for help. The servants came running. The woman had disappeared. And of course, it then came to light that it was the ghost of Sybil Penn. And we know it's Sybil Penn's ghost because she looks exactly like the stone effigy of her tomb. Unfortunately, the baby died less than 2 weeks later. So Sybil Penn gets this awful reputation as sort of being a harbinger of death. But actually, lots of other people have seen her and recorded their sightings. And one particular person called Jane Craig, she describes the ghost of Sybil Penn as being very gently kind and very lonely were her exact words. And so I don't think that she had come to bring death to that baby. I think that you remember, she was a nursemaid in life. She was a nurse to Edward and possibly Mary and definitely Elizabeth as well. So I like to tell her story and say, no, actually, I think she was probably maybe trying to help the baby, maybe, alert someone that the baby needed attention. So I like those two ghost stories, but there are so many more.
Oh, wow. Do people see ghosts at particular times? I'm thinking, does it have to be quiet? Maybe the winter, dark? I don't know. I can't imagine there's much ghost activity in the height of summer when there's thousands of people streaming through.
So, funny enough, most of our ghost reportings are from October and November. A lot of things seem to happen around about that time. Two of our ghost stories are actually very much linked to the 2nd of November as well, which is actually All Souls Day, the Day of the Dead, because that's the day that Catherine Howard, of course, the rumours surrounding Catherine Howard were presented to Henry VIII. And it's also the day that 2 skeletons were discovered in one of the courtyards as well. And they are also said to haunt that area. So, yeah, a lot of things happen October, November.
Interesting. Yeah. And people are primed for it, I think, at that time of year as well.
Yeah. It's just when days are getting shorter, nights are getting longer. Yeah. Everyone's been on it.
Chill in the air.
Yeah.
Perfect for a ghost sighting. They used to do sleepovers at the palace. They come back yet?
No. So we used to do the sleepover. We used to do that twice a year. So you would come for the whole evening, you'd get a meal, you get a lecture. And again, I used to do the tours for that. So we on that, we did various tours. We used to do the salacious gossip tours, which was where we told all the really naughty, juicy history. We used to do ghost tours. We also used to do the macabre tour, a tour as well, which was when we used to take you up on the 3rd floor and tell you some of the rather gruesome deaths that have happened at Hampton Court Palace as well. And then you'd get to sleep in the cartoon gallery. Well, I say sleep. It depended on how many people were snoring. But yeah, they were great fun. But no, at the moment, there's no plans to bring them.
We need to get those back because I didn't get to do one I thought there'd be ample opportunity, and now they've gone. I want to do one. So got at least one booking if they come back. So I've got one more question before we wrap up the main part of the interview and then go on to the Patreon questions. Now, this might be the most difficult question based on what you've told us so far. If you could guide anywhere else, where would you choose to do that?
So this was a really difficult question because there are so many places that I absolutely love. And of course, I would love to guide at places like Hever. I absolutely love Hever Castle. But actually, I'm going to plumb for Windsor. And that is because the fact that no one is allowed to guide at Windsor, apart from their own staff. But Windsor Castle, I would love to guide Windsor Castle because it's, again, seeped in history, absolutely steeped. Lots of different periods of build, again. And of course, still a royal home. So, yeah.
Again, another survivor due to Cromwell taking a liking to it.
Absolutely. Yeah. Again, it's been in constant use. So for, nearly 1,000 years now. It's amazing.
That is incredible. A good choice. So before we wrap up this main part of the interview, let us take this opportunity to let people know where they can find you online and see what you're up to.
So I have a website with a couple of my colleagues, and that is just called The History Guides. So if you Google The History Guide, you'll find us. And I am also on Instagram and Facebook. I'm Hampton Court Tour Guide. So if you have a look for Hampton Court Tour Guide, hopefully you'll find me. I must admit, I haven't been posting very regularly lately because I've been incredibly busy. But I hope to get back on with that this summer. So you can find me there. And of course, if you ever do book a tour, you can book. Again, I do take private bookings. You can find me on TripAdvisor. But you can book me through the palace. So if you ever want a roof tour or a costume tour, please do contact the contact centre, and I would love to take people around, show them all the special bits.
That's it. Well, I love your tours, so yeah, I would thoroughly recommend you as anyone's guide at Hampton Court, definitely. Thank you so much for that.
No, thank you.
So Emma has asked, what is one room or area that isn't open to the public that you wish was?